Thanks everybody for joining us for the last talk of this session. This is Sam Spencer with Digitizing Democracy. Take it away. Make him feel welcome, please.
Thank you for coming, by the way. This was a last-minute session. I was asked to represent it because a handful of people didn't get a chance to see this yesterday. And I'm going to talk about a pretty cool Django application that I've been working on in my job as the Library Innovations Manager at Parliament House. If you want to tweet them, that's their Twitter account, so that'll be fun. That's my office. I work there. It's kind of rad. I like it. I work for the Parliamentary Library, and for those of you who don't know what we do, we provide impartial services to members and senators to give them the information needed to do their jobs. But we also produce a publication called the Parliamentary Handbook, which is one of our flagship products. We do this at the start of every parliament. We produce a large culmination of statistics and biographies on parliamentarians throughout history, from Federation on to today. So that's what we do. And it's really interesting. It's a really rich, interesting data set. And I was a computer scientist, never a historian. And I came along and I found that I'm now a historian on political histories. It's kind of cool. And they said, we want to make an app. We want to do stuff with this data besides just print a book. I said, okay, cool. Where's the data? They said, there. Okay, no, all right, that's not necessarily true. It was in a bunch of Excel files. So it was still not much better, but there was some structure around it. So I was like, how do you start recording this information? What do you do with this large data set? It was huge. Well, huge-ish, but very long and lots of weird inconsistencies in it. And we did a lot of research around finding an ontology for political histories and political engagement, and there really isn't one. The closest there is a platform or an information model called Popolo, which comes out of the open data and open civic communities around describing engaged citizen journalists talking about what they think goes on inside Parliament, but it's never been the other way around. So we started to tease it out and go, well, we've got all of this information. Let's really, let's test this in anger. And we found that it wasn't quite enough. So Popolo would describe organisations, memberships, but we needed to talk about ministries and shadow ministries and different political chambers and electorates, and it's a whole bunch of rich information. And we started getting an insanely big data model that we couldn't get our heads around. And that comes to my first little project. So as a programmer, I write code first. Before I write anything else, I was writing a lot of code, was writing data models, trying to get my head around what it was. And I built a little thing called Django, Spaghetti and Meatballs, which got a really good reception yesterday. I found out there are some people who use it. So has anybody heard of it? No? Oh, that's okay. Well, now you have. No, that's okay. There was quite a few yesterday in the Django con. It was kind of cool. So Django, Spaghetti and Meatballs, what it does is it takes all of your help text and doc strings inside of your Django models, and it produces UML, or entity relationship diagrams, to show you what's actually in there. And this is an interactive HTML page where you can kind of hover over any of the meatballs and get more information about what it is. And the reason I went about that is because I'm incredibly lazy. I was routinely rebuilding this database, rebuilding this information model, and trying to understand it. And rather than spend 5 minutes a day just redrawing the diagram, I spent about 2 weeks building something that I could, be reused by the open source community to actually do this for any description. And I've used it on a number of Django projects now, basically as a way to kind of auto-document stuff. Because we've got models.py generating databases and admin interfaces and documentation, and now modeling diagrams, so that when you get given a monolith of data models, you can go, oh, that's what it is. And it comes out something like this. So this is an interface for a very unique individual. This is Frank Ford. Has anybody heard of Frank Ford? No? Okay. You're going to be really, really great at trivia after this talk. Frank Ford was Australia's shortest serving Prime Minister. He served for 6 days. As you can see, there's a little blip right there, that line, just there. That was his service as Prime Minister. We didn't have one, and he stepped up and then was promptly kicked out. But he then became, prior to his service, he was a member of the Queensland Lower House. He left and was High Commissioner for Canada, and then he came back to Australia and was back in the Lower House of Queensland. Oh, that's really interesting. That's a rich piece of information about this individual. And then we started going, we've got to be able to tell bigger and badder stories about these people. What else can we do? We've got all this discrete information. So we started looking at another side project called the Django Data Interrogator. So this one is really under the radar, but it got some traction yesterday, and I'm going to describe how this works in a little bit more depth. But basically what this is when you've got a big data set, you do want to do analytics on it. You want to start finding information out. And we at the Parliamentary Library got a lot of information requests around things that happened for particular individuals or in particular circumstances. So am I the First Minister to blah? Am I the first shadow minister for this electorate? Am I this? Am I that? And it allowed us to start, getting this information and doing really rich transformations on it. So what we could do is we could actually query all of the fields, and then it would produce really, really efficient queries to pull that out in a flat structure. And the way that it worked behind the scenes, and I'm going to quickly rush through this because this was a lightning talk I gave yesterday, and I've kind of slotted these slides in. What it would do is it would take a dot annotated models path and start constructing the double underscore, take a models path, split it by an equal sign. That gives us an array. We can then put in the double underscores to do querying through the Django models, through the ORM, wrap it in a dictionary, throw it to Quarks in a filter, and all of a sudden that's our query. Like that's, it's really simple. It took me about 2 weeks to figure that out, but that's how it is. For interest's sake, the reason, all you need to do to get from this to this is actually just literally change the dots. The reason the dots are there is so you can control left and right through a text field. You can't do that with underscores. And additionally, with actually getting fields out of the database, we have a number of form fields that come through the web service. They get spat in. We split them into an array. We clean them up. Any hands at the end. We arg it into a values query set, and then that gives us a very, very efficient query. We don't get the entire Django item back. Values doesn't allow us to do that. It just gives us the very, very specific fields, and it actually generates relatively efficient SQL really easily. So we could just go, boom, here's a query, boom, here's a query. One of the ones we got was finding out when the spill happened last year between the Liberals, people kind of made this assumption that Malcolm Turnbull had a really young, fresh-faced ministry. And it was like, yeah, that feels right. It feels truthy, doesn't it? And they said, and somebody said, can you actually prove that? I'm like, oh, I think so. So we went about, did it. We said, find all the ministries, find someone's date of birth, find their first ministry position, subtract those, sum them up, do the average. And it is, on average, Malcolm Turnbull's ministry was about 2 years younger than Tony Abbott's, but not the youngest. So it was he was 42, Abbott's was about 44 years on average. The youngest was about 36 years on average. 36 years old on average, which was kind of interesting. This is another really, really, really cool one. I love doing this because you kind of, it's a really interesting topic now, female representation in Parliament. You're like, oh, what's going on there? So does anybody know our first female member and senator? No, I actually had someone know this yesterday. Enid Lyon and Dorothy Tagney were our first member and senator respectively. They were both elected in 1942. But one thing that we didn't know is that's a piece of trivia that comes up really often. Again, you're going to win at trivia nights after this. But there was this gap here. So you can see that in the Senate, there's always been a women's representation since 1942. Always. They got in and boom, problem solved. But there were these stop-starts throughout the entirety of history in the lower house until the 1980s, and it was only here that it actually took off. There was a 25-year gap where it didn't quite catch on with the Australian public, and you go, well, that's kind of neat. So, all of a sudden we've given an avenue for social researchers, not computer scientists, to start doing social research on what was happening in Parliament. Coincidentally, this blip here caused me so much grief producing this graph. This is Nancy Buttfield, a senator from South Australia, who decided she didn't like getting elected, but senator. There you go. Senator? There. What she did was she would routinely retire and then get a casual vacancy and come straight back in. Didn't get elected for 9 years. That happened. This is your history, by the way. Isn't it kind of fascinating? This is what happened in your country. This is another really good one that gets giggles. This was a graph that we produced because somebody said it couldn't be done, and we're like, oh no, we could do that. This is a breakdown of every political party representation since Federation for the entire Senate. Each of these slices in the graph is a time period. So every time something happened, we recalculated, and we produced these slivers. You can see that in 1940, comes in, that's the new Liberal Party. The Liberal Party didn't actually come in until 1942. I'm just going to shift this, sorry. No, not going to happen. 1942. But the Labor Party, this big red bit, they were there since pretty much Federation, probably pre-Federation days. You can see this green sliver, that's actually the Nationals, and when they changed their name, this is the actual Greens. Grey is all your independents, and this lovely little yellow squashed elephant is the Democrats. I showed this off many times. It's a squashed elephant, isn't it? But again, really fascinating stuff to see how the breakdowns have changed. This is a much smoother graph because of the 6-year terms and the half generation of splits. And you can see where the double dissolutions happen because there are big jumps. And lastly, I presented this yesterday, and every time I do this presentation, I put in on this day. Yesterday was really boring. There was a couple of birthdays. Today, no. Today is actually a really fascinating day in history. Today's Christopher Pine's birthday, and you can have your feels about that later, whether or not... No, like this isn't a political talk. If you like him or not, whatever. The interesting fact is 1940, James Fairbairn, Henry Gullett, and Geoffrey Street all ceased representing Parliament because they passed away. So today is the 76th anniversary of the 1940 Canberra air disaster. What happened was 3 members of I think it was the Menzies administration, they were flying in a plane in Canberra during World War II and crashed. That happened today, and we can kind of query the database and get that because it's there. So that happened. There we go. This is my mandatory architecture slide. So this is the one I really like presenting. Yeah, it's pretty funny. Somebody suggested at the start, use MongoDB. I'm like, no, not going to happen. This is what it actually looks like under the scenes. Like, it's mostly Python, mostly Django. We use Haystack for all of our search engine work. If you haven't used Haystack before, it's an insanely great Django tool that provides a query set wrapper around a number of really good search engines. So we used Whoosh because it's pure Python and it meant install was really easy, but Elasticsearch, the AWS version of Elasticsearch, I think now Zapier, a bunch of really cool search engines, you can just query it like you would query a Django dataset. This grey box was what our IT department dictated. They said, if you want to do this, you're going to have to do it on Microsoft SQL, iOS, and Windows, so that we can secure it within our environment, because that's what we know, because if we do this, it's going to be secure enough for parliamentary services. What that is, and I'm going to make sure this is easily tweetable and capture it, is that means that Django has been installed in a government IT environment as standard protocol, and it works out of the box. No arguments. There's a Commonwealth Department, Parliamentary Library, Microsoft, Django. It works. Why Django? Oh, this is my good one. I thought Django's exciting. I said, this is cool. Like, you could do stuff really quickly, really easy, really fun. That's not what I said. Django's boring. I said this yesterday, it got a lot of laughs, but it got a lot of interest because I said Django's boring now. Django's architecture. Django's infrastructure that just works. Django is something you don't fight. Django is something you install and you just do it. So it's a matter of us discussing the fact that, like, boring isn't bad. Boring is actually quite exciting because boring means that nobody's going to fight you on it. Boring means it's plumbing that just works. And then lastly, like, it all sounds like it's gone so smoothly, but up until now, but it actually didn't. So this is a term that I stole from somebody who worked on it with me, that we termed data banana skins. Things that will slip you up when you try and do data-intensive work with Django. This is Francis McLean. Francis McLean was born in 1863. Don't know when. Probably know it was 1863. We had to do a lot of work around birth confidences or date confidences in general, especially for early history. There are some dates where we just don't know the accuracy of it, and that's not a fact of bad data, it's a fact of life. We couldn't get around that. We had to choose between a number of implementations of pure string, faked dates, a number of different options, and the one we sat on was an actual date stamp within the database with a mask to tell us the accuracy of it. The reason that we took that approach was because it meant we could do really, really efficient date queries and push them down onto the database. So through the Data Interrogator, all of our date manipulations and date subtractions, date averaging, all that kind of stuff we could do because we had a date that was about right. So where we had no idea, we just kind of put January 1st, but the mask let us know the accuracy of that. So we could say, you know, when we're doing our aggregations across an average of all parliamentarians, you know, a year wiggle room isn't going to hurt too much. But when we're displaying it, we could apply the mask to actually get some understanding. And that's just a snippet of the code that kind of talks about how it's done. So it does a multi-field work behind the scenes. So you can basically assign it like you would assign a property. And if your date isn't a full date, it will do what's necessary to apply the mask in the database. So it's actually quite neat. This is another really good one, King O'Malley. Love King O'Malley. Has anybody heard of King O'Malley? You're missing out. This is a great guy. King O'Malley, nobody laughed. Like, everybody laughed at this one yesterday. We don't know where King O'Malley was born. King O'Malley wasn't a king and wasn't Irish and may not have been a Commonwealth citizen, which questions whether or not he was eligible to be in Parliament. Probably born in Kansas, but all records are very inconclusive. So we don't know where he was born, and there's no way to get around that. Like, we tried, there's no way to store an approximate place of birth. You just put it in a string and deal with it later. Another interesting fact, King O'Malley is the reason the Labor Party is spelt as it is. He believed that the American spellings were much more concise, and it was going to be the way that the colonies, once they broke from England, were going to spell words. So he said, the Australian Labor Party, we're going to get ahead of the system, we're going to spell it without an O, without a U. So if you've ever wondered why there's that difference, he did it. There's a lovely pub named after him, but he didn't drink. And this is another really good one. So this is Caroline Jacobson. This is a term that I'm trying to get to catch on. So this is one of the few things I want you to retweet. Jacobson's law. If Excel can misinterpret your data, it will, and in the worst possible way. Why do I call this Jacobson's law? Every piece of information in Parliament House gets a unique identifier, and they're all publicly available, so you're not about to see anything secret. It's just not really talked about. Caroline Jacobson's ID is 0E4. Excel decided that what that is an exponential number. It thought it was 0 times 10 to the power of 4, which was 0, and would routinely die. There was a couple of 1E4s as well that caused IDs to just fall over. Okay, all right, I'll accept that. 1863 would sometimes be interpreted as a number of days past 1900, which is how Excel stores dates, by the way. If you didn't know, Excel stores dates as days past 1901. And occasionally this just dumbfounded me. 1901-01-01 is obviously a date, but Excel decided it was actually a number. Other really good ones that we found. These are the assumptions we got drastically wrong when trying to model parliamentary data. Ministers need to be elected. Constitutionally, that's false. Didn't find that out for a while. It happened twice in the very first parliament. There were two people who were just assigned to be ministers for 3 months. Up to 3 months, you can be a minister for up to 3 months, according to the Constitution. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. If someone resigns a seat, only one person will take that seat. That's wrong. You can have somebody who can resign twice within one session and be replaced once. Somebody can resign and replace themselves. Somebody can resign and not be reappointed. Someone can never replace themselves is again patently wrong. If you win an election, you are elected. There are many cases in quite recent history where that's not true. You can win an election, get a full record, and then there's a High Court challenge to you actually holding the seat, as happened in Western Australia. And if you do everything right, no matter what you do, if you do everything right, you only have to do it once. That's just wrong. The reason why Django was great for us was because we actually threw away our database so many times. We did a lot of development on SQLite, which meant that rebuilding our database was as simple as deleting the file and remigrating and deleting the file and remigrating. And we did. We went through multiple iterations because it was just so hard. The reason why it's important to talk about that is it's really cool to mention that Django is really good at revamping databases really quickly, like just rolling them back up. The changes in 1.8, 1.7, 1.8 for all the migration stuff were amazing for us for all of our changes. These are our timelines. So we're looking at a release externally later this year with open source development going soon after that. One of the questions from yesterday is it applicable to other areas? And yeah, it is. We actually looked at genericizing this enough that areas who were interested in other bicameral or unicameral parliaments could actually take this, because it's really interesting ways to manage this information. But we've also already got Django, Spaghetti and Meatballs and the Data Interrogator up on GitHub for people to access and use in their own projects, and quite a few people are, which was amazingly flattering. Lessons learned, Excel just will destroy your data. And that's not a bad thing. Like, I don't want people to think I'm hating on Excel. It was actually really, really valuable for us to clean our data. But we did have to go through multiple iterations of going Excel, generating a CSV, importing it into Django, realizing it messed it up, going back to Excel and going through the steps and cleaning up data. So that's something to be aware of. Historical data is messy and difficult, and sometimes you just can't get around that. You will always start again. Good data is difficult to find in the real world. When you're doing a historical project, it's actually hard to get good information. And if you can digitize and share it, that's a really positive thing for a lot of people in the community. Yeah, Django was great for us. It made the development of this amazing. We were able to do a lot of really interesting queries on what, why we collect this data. It's broadened what we can do. It's sped up how quickly we can do stuff, and it gave our internal IT guys quite a lot of oversight on a broader parliamentarian data model. I'm a big data modeling guy. It's a really interesting space to, and it gave us the opportunity to test a lot of that on the bare metal, kind of on the ground writing stuff. And then yeah, that's us. Tweet the library, tweet me. That's my shortest email you can find me on, and that's my lovely rabbit Anara. So yeah, any questions? Do they have to come up?
Yeah. So we have time for some questions, about 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause first. I think I have one to start off. Are there any other countries where where this sort of data has been made available? No, like this is political data and social science data is a very interesting space where they're starting to grow quite rapidly, but not to this depth depth and breadth of political history. No. Okay. Cool. Thank you. Anybody else has a piece of line up?
I was just curious about the LDAP AD part of your architecture.
Yep.
Why do you think you need that, and if you did it again, would you still use it?
I'll go in reverse order. Yes, I would still do it again because IT said that's like LDAP and Active Directory were how we were doing all of our authentication internally. That's the basis of they actually would explain this much better, but that was the basis of our entire authentication within the building. There's a huge security framework around that, and we were able to plug in quite easily with a bunch of Python stuff. So yeah, I probably would. Yeah.
So with sort of social media and massive online presences, people have trouble with, I guess, like data leakage and unintended side consequences of things like Facebook and Twitter and information being used in ways they didn't expect. Mm-hmm. I guess the National Library stuff's all public domain, but have you ever had any sort of issues where more than what was expected could be used now that it's digitised and it's more searchable?
Sorry, I'm Parliamentary Library, not the National Library.
Apologies.
No, it's okay. We haven't had any issues. Like a lot of our data is kept internal. Like we don't release it. Like we don't actually release any of the information that we do to the public because it's protected. So yeah, we haven't had an issue with data leakage like that. No.
Hi, my question is, how'd you get your job?
I would suggest the first thing I did was I went to apsjobs.gov.au. If you want to get into the public service, that's the place to go. Not really networking. I actually kind of just applied for it. The job title kind of really interested me. I've always been a little bit of a political nerd, and I applied because I wanted to work at Parliament House. And I just kind of fell into it really. And it was just luck that they said, this is the project that we want you to work on. What can you do? And I was like, oh, I'm a programmer. I can roll with this. So yeah, it was but come up and talk to me afterwards if you want. APSjobs.gov.au is a great place to go.
Just wondering, did you do any geospatial analysis, and did you have to do geocoding of place names? Because I assume that would be badly spelled and
That's a good question. Yes. So this was one of the next phases for the project is, obviously everybody knows that electoral boundaries change every election. Ha ha ha! Oh, stop it. No, so one of the problems that we had was looking at electoral boundaries across time. So every election, electoral boundaries change, and they actually migrate. So as populations move, you can see the electoral boundaries actually shift across a landscape. We had all of those readily digitized, and we're looking at using GeoDjango to store them within the database so that you could look at an individual and the electorate that they were in at that point in time, rather than just a broad name. We're also looking at doing geocoding from place names to geographies for some future visualization work on places of birth. One of the things that people don't often realize is just how far politicians have come from in Australia. Like, we've had representatives from England, the UK. Chris Watson, one of our first prime ministers, third I think, was born in Chile. We've had people born in undisclosed waters off the coast of Australia. That's it. Coast of Australia, born there. So yeah, we had a lot of it. Like, it's been difficult for us in that sense of mapping places of birth. But for a lot of the electorate stuff, we're looking at doing another big project around digitizing or getting those digitized files into GeoDjango. So.
All right. So thank you all for attending this session. This concludes the afternoon session. Again, this was a bit of a surprise reprisal of this talk to fill those slots. So let's make sure we give Sam an extra big thank you for filling it.